This is a video I'm making just to cover the modifications I've made to my Celestron Firstscope 76. One of the first things you're going to want to do, obviously, is make a collimation cap out of your cover that you got, your dust cover for your focuser, by putting a hole right in the middle of it. That's kind of a no-brainer. If I look through here with my phone, surprise, there's no secondary in there. That's because I've got it over here. The secondary, the way it's designed is there's two pieces of plastic here. You can see them right here. There's about almost 2 millimeters of a gap between them. If you look in there, you can see a spring that's in there in addition to the threads from the screw. That spring was added by me. You need a spring or something that acts as a spring because these screws only provide a pull. They only can pull the mirror support block towards the front of this piece right here. They can't push it because there's no threading or anything for the screws to engage in here. It's just the heads of the screws that just rest up against this block in the back. So you kind of have to keep that in mind, and I apologize that I'm recording this on my cell phone. So the way it's built by default is there's a little bit of a peg on the top piece here in the center between the three screws, and there's an O-ring that fits around that. The O-ring's about, I don't know, maybe 1.25 millimeters thick, but when you first get it, I noticed it can get deformed if you tighten the screws down too much. But that serves as kind of a really basic spring. You know, if you got that O-ring and compression is kind of pushed back, so that's what provides the push mechanism from the factory. I found it to be a horrible design. You can't really get too much travel out of these screws. And granted, you don't really need too much for collimation, but in the case of my scope, the secondary was not focused, or was not centered underneath my focuser, so I needed a way of moving this secondary back, and the way I decided to do that was replace the factory screws with longer hex head machine screws, and replace the O-ring with a spring. It's a pretty stiff spring. You can't make it too thick because you might not be able to collapse it enough to bring the mirror forward. So it really comes down to looking at your scope and seeing if how far forward that mirror is, if it is out of position, and then give yourself maybe 1 millimeter of extra leeway going forward when you're choosing your spring. So in my case, I figured that I could probably move the mirror needed to be moved back about almost 2 millimeters. So I gave myself about 1.5 millimeters of for the spring in full compression, so I could have about 0.5 millimeter of extra travel forward there. So once it's all reassembled, just simply moving all three screws in unison will move the mirror assembly backwards or forwards, and then just adjusting them one at a time will allow you to adjust the tilt of the mirror for collimation. It's worked out pretty well. I haven't had any issues with it being wobbly or anything like that. So now the mirror is properly centered under the focuser. You'll notice that there are some nuts on these screws. That's because the head of the screw has to be in contact with that block in the back. It's not a threaded hole or anything. So I had to add some washers or some nuts because those screws were a little bit too long. Also, you can't pick screws that are very long because they'll actually run through the support block here and hit the back of the mirror, and you don't want to do that. So you can see that the one opposite of the stalk here can be a little bit longer because of the slant of that support piece. So you can get one that's a little bit longer for that, and that's why that one does not have the two nuts on it. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back in my scope and cover the second issue that might arise with this scope. I'll put the phone down for just a moment. For those who don't know, the stalk on this thing is secured with that screw right there on the front of the focuser. So that's a Phillips head screw. If you tighten or if you loosen that, you can take the secondary assembly off. I'm going to go ahead and put the phone down while I put the secondary back in place. Now obviously I'm going to have to recollimate this, but I was discussing the changes I made on the forums and wanted to at least have a video so folks knew what the heck I was talking about. I also apologize if I sound like I'm a little bit out of breath. I've not been feeling well the last couple of days. Alright, so I've got the screw in there but not very tight. And what I want to show is, I'm pretty sure this is going to be out of whack. Actually, I got it pretty close. So what's important to note here is if you look at, let me get this thing centered here first. Actually, let me point it towards the light. I'll give myself a little bit more to look at. If you look at the secondary, you can see that plastic support block to the left of it, and you can make out the gap there as well. What you'll also notice is that in the reflection of the secondary, you can see the stalk. That's the reflection of the secondary off of the primary in the back. And what you'll notice is that the stalk in this case is not aligned with the center line of that support block. So what you do is you twist this along. You're basically trying to screw this in and out, you know, at the stalk here. And hey, look, I finally get focused on my camera. That will rotate this mirror. So you want that stalk to be lined up with the center line of that support block. So you can adjust it one way, that's the wrong way. Okay, now you can see the support block pretty well, and you can see I overcorrected it just a little bit, so move it down just a hair. It looks pretty close. And there it is. So that fixes that rotation. Another rotational problem you might have is that mirror on the secondary holder here, it might actually be spun around the optical axis. In which case, God help you on trying to fix that. You can see that white right behind the mirror. That is some two-sided tape. It's pretty sticky stuff. It's pretty durable. I tried to pop the mirror off. That mirror is pretty thin, as you saw. So I wouldn't recommend putting too much force on it. Plus, if that tape does give out, then you're left with the situation where you have a secondary mirror flying through your room and possibly ruining the coating on it. So some folks have recommended taking a razor blade to it, possibly using some dental floss as sort of a saw, and just work it back and forth till you cut it off. I guess if you did that, you could also replace that with some slightly thicker tape if you needed to move the secondary backwards in the scope. But I chose to do it this way because it's now adjustable by moving these screws. So that pretty much covers that modification I've done to the scope. I'll have to recollimate it now, but the other thing is I replaced the crappy finder scope with a nice green laser I use. So now I can just use it for quickly pointing at something in the sky and having it in the center of the scope when I look through it. And of course, this thing is only an f4, so you can put a pretty low power eyepiece in there and you get a pretty wide field of view anyway, so it kind of negates the need for having a finder. But the one they shipped with this thing is pretty pretty horrible. So that's pretty much it for today. Probably in the next week I'm going to cover the next change I'm going to be doing, which is making a new focuser for this. This focuser's not the greatest either. If I back it out, that's the grease popping that you're hearing. It's not something sticking. It's on the rack and pinion here. If I move this out, you can see there's a lot of play there. I mean, I'm hardly moving this at all with my fingers. So that's pretty lousy. It's just a metallized plastic here, so it's not the greatest quality, but hey, you know, it's a $60 scope. You can't expect everything for that. For the price, this is actually a really decent scope. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. Hopefully once I get the new focuser 3D printed, I'm going to cover the installation of that. Also, I need to reduce the distance here, because I'm going to try to do some prime focus photography using a couple of cameras that I've got, and I found that when this thing's racked all the way in, it's nowhere near where it needs to be. Also, the other problem is when it's racked all the way in, that focuser tube, that draw tube, actually obstructs a pretty significant portion of the aperture. So I'm going to probably put a shorter draw tube in there and then use extension pieces when I go to do visual observation